papers and stationery enthusiasts, it's Christy here, a snarky Wordsworth over on Instagram and Reddit, and today I have a new video for everybody out there all about my absolute favorite nib and why I think everybody should give it a try, and that is the Esterbrook Journaler nib. I love this thing. I seriously do. I originally got this pen in a 1.1 stub. Didn't love it. I mean, I didn't hate it. Still a good pen, but it was maybe a little too much of a true 1.1 stub for me. I write very small. I also like to write quickly. I like to journal sort of off the cuff, you know, and that kind of nib is just not conducive to particularly legible writing for me most of the time. Whereas this journaler is just so easy to use, very much an everyday pen. I can write quickly, I can write clearly, I can write whether I'm using my pretty standard small writing or it looks still great if I write with much larger lettering, and it still has enough flair to keep me constantly interested. It's just one of those nibs that I think everybody should have in their arsenal if they want to have a little bit of something special. So the Esterbrook Journaler nib is really actually quite interesting. It's part of Esterbrook's custom nib series. And that custom nib series has a number of offerings. This one, you can kind of get a little bit of a look at it here, is done by Gina Salarino of Los Angeles' Custom Nib Studio. She's the one who created it, and it's a bit of an homage to the vintage Esterbrook 9314M nib. So it's a bit of a stub based off of a medium nib, and it just writes so well. I don't know if people who love like really broad stubs will find this one too narrow, but for someone who wants a little bit of style to go with her writing, no matter what it is that I'm writing, this is just so perfect for me, especially since I do have smaller handwriting. This works really well. Since it's based on that medium nib, it's pretty much going to be workable no matter what kind of, say, planner you're using. Say like the Hobonichi Weeks has a 4mm square. That's quite small. I cannot get my 1.1 stubs to look particularly nice in that unless I'm really taking up like a lot of real estate on a page. Whereas this one, I just write like normal and it looks great. It looks actually much better even than, say, when I'm using an extra fine nib or whatever. And it's really a lot of fun to actually write with it, to actually see how your writing turns out on the page. And let me do a little bit of a writing sample. Okay, as I was mentioning before, if you're using a planner like the Hobonichi Weeks or this is a Techo, you know, this grid is very small. It's one that I know in my experience, I have a hard time writing in and making legible when I'm using a broader nib, whether we're talking about a traditional 1.1 stub or even just like a broad, or even my Benu Euphoria, which comes in a medium nib. It's so wet that, man, it's a hot mess when I try and write and make it fit in the actual 4mm grid. But the journaler is really pretty perfect. And let me just sort of show you what the line looks like. So you can kind of see there is definitely variation. There is a fair amount of style, and you can absolutely see a lot of the characteristics of the ink. You can see just like on a more traditional stub nib, you have a much broader downstroke and a much finer horizontal stroke. But since we are dealing with a medium nib, you do lose a bit of the extra variation you would get with a much broader base. So, you know, it's certainly not quite as highly stylized as if I were using a 1.1, but I don't always need that. I think there is plenty of visual interest even when we're dealing with something much narrower like this. And again, it's all about keeping my interest while I write. I like that I can still write quickly. I can still write legibly. This is generally how I write. I don't have to adjust the size of lettering or the spacing. I don't have to think about it really consciously like I do with a broader nib. And you can still see all of the different shading. This is, by the way, Vinta Ink's Fortaleza. I love this ink a lot, but you can see you still get all of that beautiful shading, even though you're not dealing with a super duper broad stub style nib. All right, I did want to give you a little bit of a chance to compare some of the other stub and stub-like nibs that I have in my collection, just so you can sort of see what the lines look and how they're different, because not every stub is going to be the same or even vaguely close. So the first one here is the Edison Glenmont with the 1.1 stub. I do think that when I ordered it initially, it was listed as a cursive italic, but for whatever reason, my order confirmation does not have that information in it. But you can see like very crisp lines. That differentiation is beautiful, but man, it is a very wet writer, and the line is so thick that I have to actively think about how I'm putting letters on the page. I tried journaling with it actually the other weekend, and it was a little bit of an exercise in futility. I kept on writing much faster than I should have been, and the page was a hot mess. But if you do consciously think, it is a gorgeous, gorgeous pen. And it produces a really lovely line. So you can see here, it is significantly broader than that journaler nib, but it has a much crisper, has a much crisper edge. There's no tipping whatsoever. So it does have a bit of drag when you're writing. Not in a bad way, just it definitely does. Different writing experience. So it's one of those pens that I have to think about when I'm using it, which, you know, is not always a bad thing, but definitely not something I want, say, in a note-taking situation. Though why you'd be using a stub during a note-taking situation, I don't know, but just to be clear. Now, one of the other stubs is the Maiora Alpha with the 1.1 stub. And you can see how even though they're both calling themselves 1.1, there's even there a little bit of variation, both with how wet the pen writes and just how thick each line is. I actually really, really love this particular pen. I think it makes a beautiful, beautiful line, but I do have a much drier ink in it. This particular ink, I believe, is Troublemaker's Petrichor, which is a very dry ink in my experience. So that is also affecting how the feed handles the ink, you know. But I will say the stub on this is a touch narrower than the one on the Glenmont. But yeah, it's beautiful. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous nib. Again, you see there's, oh, maybe you don't see. See? No, see? Focus, please. Or not. But it's another one, no tipping whatsoever. It does write, I would say, much more smoothly than the Edison Glenmont. For whatever reason, I do find it is a very nice stub, but it was not out of the box nice. It took me a little bit of time. It took me several hours to get it to the point where it was flowing really nicely and putting ink down on the page the way that I wanted it to. Prior to that, I was having a lot of hard starts, a little bit of skipping, but I was willing to play with it, and now I really do enjoy it very much. The next one down after that is the TWSBI Diamond Mini with the 1.1 stub in it. I adore TWSBI stub nibs. They were really the first stub that I got that I loved, and I love them out of the box. I know I seem to hear a lot of like odd mixed feelings about them, but all of the TWSBI stubs that I've picked up have been perfect the second I pull them out of the box. Like, I ink it up, it's ready to go. I've never had to play with one. I've never had to tune it at all. I've been very, very lucky. I love the way it writes. It's a very comfortable stub, but even this one, I do sometimes have to be a bit conscious of how I write, just because with I think that they write a bit wet. So if you're writing with a wet writer and you're also using a wet ink, it's like kind of crazy. So a lot of times this is where I'll do either a shimmer ink or a heavy sheener, and that sort of alleviates that extra wetness to the pen, and then I can write comfortably again. But it is one that I always recommend to people if you aren't super familiar with stub nibs, because you can get like the Eco for mid-30s, oftentimes even less if you find a sale, and it just is an excellent nib. And then the last one that is not the journaler that I wanted to talk about is one of my newest additions, and that is the Pilot Custom 742 with the SU nib, which is Sutabu, and it's a really, really great stub nib. I absolutely love writing with this one. I actually think this one and the journaler kind of have been vying for top position for me. Now, I will say I use exclusively Pilot Iroshizuku inks in here because it's a very, very wet line of inks. I'd heard tons of things about it being quite a dry writer and scratchy. I don't find it scratchy at all. This one, I believe, is Fuyu Syogun, which is a very wet ink, by the by, and it works beautifully. It's not showing as much shading on my camera as it is in real life. It's gorgeous, like beautiful gray shading, and it's just a really comfortable pen to write with. I would say this one is probably the most comparable to how I would write if I was just using a standard non custom ground pen. You know, if I were just using an extra fine or a fine or whatever, this is how I write, and I do really like the way that this one turns out too. And then, oh, sorry, I should probably show you the nib for that one. You can see they keep getting a little bit finer as we go. And there is a bit of tipping on this one. So it's just, for me, altogether a much smoother writer. Did I show the TWSBI? I don't think that I did. We'll rewind. Let me show you the TWSBI. So you can see on this one a little bit broader than that SU nib that I just showed you from the Pilot. So stub nibs really are different from company to company, style to style. With some brands, it's even different from pen line to pen line. And then finally, of course, we've got the journaler. And as I mentioned earlier, you do lose some of the definition just because it's a much narrower base with that medium base, but you still see the flare. You still see that variation between the kinds of lines that you're doing, and it's just such a comfortable pen to write with. I don't change anything with how I write day to day versus how do I write with the journaler. I just go, and I don't have to worry about speed. I don't worry about hard starts. It just works really, really well, and I absolutely love it. If you are just getting started, I honestly think that the journaler is an excellent way to go, just because it offers an experience that is so similar to an everyday standard writing nib experience. It is a little bit pricey, mainly because Esterbrook's pens tend to be a little bit pricey. It's just a steel nib. It's not, you know, a gold nib or anything the way that, say, the Custom 742 SU nib is, but it's still one of my favorites. And that's, you know, one of those things that it varies from person to person if you really need a gold nib or you don't. I love this journaler, and again, a bit pricey maybe, but it is a custom grind. It is glorious, and I would never give this one up, and I hope to actually add another one of these nibs to my collection soon. So if you happen to have any questions about this nib, or, you know, my experience with even the SD 1.1 or whatever with stub nibs, please feel free to comment below and ask. I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. If you have any questions about anything else from this video, definitely feel free. Or if you have opinions about particular stubs, or if you think that there's a stub nib that I 100% should check out, I absolutely want to hear about that. If you have managed to stick around until this point of the video, thank you so much. You are absolutely awesome. I love putting these things together, so it's always just kind of a joy. If this video has been useful, interesting, entertaining, whatever, please do consider hitting that like button, or perhaps even subscribing to the channel. As always, thank you again so much for joining me, and hopefully I will see you next time. Bye-bye.